Welcome to post podcast video 4722 about Alex Hormozi and Tony Robbins. Okay. So I wrestled with whether or not to do this particular podcast episode on this particular subject for about 5 minutes. Okay. One, because there have been so many people talking about it that I literally do not want to talk about it. And then I had to remind myself of the commitment that I made to myself as a part of my 2025 reflection. For those of you who saw my post at the beginning of the year, I made a post that talked about, some of the things that I reflected on in 2025 that I wanted to change in 2026. And one of them, lo and behold, was to talk more publicly about trends and things that I see in the industry and things that I would normally say nothing about. Right? Why? Because there's so many people talking about this that it is almost annoying. But one of the things that I mentioned in that post that I will just remind yourself or remind you and remind myself at the same time is that regardless to how many people are talking about the subject, and how marketing, quote unquote, you can't see my air quotes, it feels, the truth is, if I feel like I have something valuable to say and something to add to the conversation, something that has not been said, then it is still worth making the post, doing the podcast, doing the video, etc. And it does not matter whether 8,000 people have said something about it or not. Right? This is just my reminder that my own voice is needed. Right? So I made that commitment at the beginning of the year. And lo and behold, 2026 has started off with a bang and given me plenty of things to talk about. Okay. So let me give you a little bit of a overview of what I'm going to cover, and then you can decide whether this podcast is worth your time or not. Okay. So number one, this is far less about Alex and far less about Tony. Right. The truth is, in addition to the commitment that I just made to myself about, speaking more publicly about things, the other reason why I decided to do this podcast is because I wanted to help answer the questions that some of you may be having about the balance between uh achievement and fulfillment, right? It's one of the things that we talk about in our camp all the time, so I'm well versed to talk about this. But really, I saw so much commentary um, with different people's posts who were basically sharing takeaways and, different things that they got, uh, that it feels worth talking about it to be able to support the people specifically who resonated with the video and are kind of doing their own soul searching. That is who I'm doing this podcast for. So if that is you, then welcome. Okay. I also thought it was interesting. I always find it interesting how people respond to him, right? They're kind of in a I love them or I hate him kind of scenario. So it was interesting to see the commentary around um, Alex specifically. So here are the things that I'm going to address. Number one, I'm just going to give you my overview after having watched the video, right? I'm then going to give you my added thoughts after watching the video and listening to other people's commentary because my overview is different, right? My initial thoughts after watching the video were one thing, and then reading so much commentary about other people's, perspective made me pause, think deeper, and then there were additional things that I'm going to add as responses. So I'm going to cover both of those. I'm going to share the place that I actually disagree with Tony. I know it's against somebody's imaginary rule to disagree with gurus. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to address two specific themes that I saw in people's responses, all the different posts that I read. Lots of people had lots of things to say, but there were two themes that kind of kept showing up in different ways. So I'm going to address that. And then lastly, one of the things that I'm going to do is just give you some suggestions, some tips on how you can find the balance between the art of fulfillment and the science of achievement. Okay. All right. So because I know that there was a handful of people who will be listening to this podcast who have little to no reference on who I am, let me just tell you who I am for those people who are new. Number one, welcome, welcome. Okay. My name is LaChelle. I am an impact consultant. Um, I, in short, help ambitious, impact-driven individuals and institutions like nonprofits and schools, um, all the nonprofits, whether you're a school, a church, mental health facility, whatever. Um, Impact-driven individuals and institutions. Essentially, what I do is help them design interventions that impact millions of lives. Right? That's the short version, and we do that without self-sacrifice and without living in survival mode. Okay, because those are the two things that my helpers, those who work in helping professions, tend to have. Okay, uh, my work really goes through two core components. Part of it is program development, right? What it looks like to actually design a real intervention from your expertise based on your mission, et cetera. And then the other part is all personal development. We have a public figure curriculum that we use inside of our program. For context, I am a dually licensed therapist. Okay. That is where I'm able to talk from a personal development perspective, from a psychology perspective. I have specialties in trauma and addiction. I'm sharing all of this information with you so that way you know I'm qualified to speak to the things that I'm going to say in the remainder of this podcast. Okay. In addition to that, I have also built a successful non-therapy business, right? Most therapists have very little understanding of business because they have not built businesses, right? I, on the other hand, have built successful businesses. I've run nonprofit businesses. I run for-profit businesses. I've sold, $5 things and $50,000 things and just a wide range. And so I just happen to have a better understanding about business than the average therapist. I would say 80% of my clientele is entrepreneurs, and nonprofit leaders. And everybody that I work with is some kind of helper. They're mostly impact driven. They're very, they work hard. They like to give. They're people pleasing, many of them, not all of them. Perfectionists, self sacrificing, all the things. Okay. So let me just say you do not have to have watched the video in order to get something from the podcast. Should you watch the video? Sure. Right? Especially if you hear something throughout this podcast that you resonate with, then I would definitely encourage you to go and watch the video. It is linked to the show notes in this podcast. If you hear something that you have a question about, DM me on Facebook. Do not DM me on other platforms because I'm not on other platforms. Okay. If you DM me on some other platform, somebody else will respond. Okay. But if you want me to respond personally, then you are welcome to DM me on Facebook. I do not mind. People DM me all the time with questions or things that they hear from the podcast. I have good boundaries, so it doesn't bother me. Okay. All right. So let me just give you my overview, not of the interview, but of my opinion after having watched the interview. So, I watched the interview, and initially my response was, this just feels like you're witnessing a conversation with someone who is wrestling with what's next. Right now, for context, I watch Alex Hormozi's videos frequently. I do not watch Tony Robbins nearly as often. I don't have anything against Tony Robbins. I just don't watch his stuff as much, probably because I'm already in the personal development space and I have maybe less of the need, less of, I don't know. I've seen his stuff, but much less. So also give you that context. Okay. So when I watched the video, I thought it was fine, but it did not seem very revelatory to me. Like it did not seem out of the ordinary or something, right? And I got the take that people thought it was really profound, and I get that, right? And maybe it's just because I'm in this work, right? The thing that he happens to be struggling with is something that I support my clients with all the time. So I think that is probably why it did not land the same with me. Um, because when I watched the video, I was like, yeah, this makes sense to me. You know, I don't know. That's the best way that I could articulate it. Um, and it just felt like I was watching someone who was wrestling with figuring out what needs to change and, what is coming next. And is currently unbalanced, which is, again, when you're wrestling with something, you're almost always unbalanced. And so it just felt very normal to me, right? It did not feel like a reason to demonize Alex. It did not feel like some kind of midlife crisis or uh, some he's miserable. Like, I just didn't get any of that. It just felt like he was in the middle of wrestling as compared to people who may be in a different stage of wrestling, right? Sometimes I'm working with people and they're at the very beginning stages of wrestling, which does not seem as if he is, right? So being at the beginning of wrestling often looks like feeling like something is off, but not knowing what it is, right? A lot of my clients who have built successful businesses, 6 and 7 figure companies, and some of them have sold companies and now they're trying to figure out what's next. Like, they're usually in some kind of transition, but in the beginning, it's not very strong because oftentimes nothing is wrong, quote unquote, right? A lot of people are like, oh, well, I've built a successful business. My family is good. My health is good. Like, there's nothing wrong. When something is wrong, right, it tends to be a little louder and a little quicker. But a lot of times the wrestling starts with something very small and it just kind of feels like something is off. And then if you don't listen to it, if you don't figure out how to resolve it, then it gets a little louder, which is the place that I would say that it seems as if Alex is in, where he is not at the beginning of wrestling, he is at the middle of wrestling, right? This is, again, my opinion. And so it moves from something feels off to something is off, right? Like, no, before you couldn't put a finger on it, you can't put a name on it. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I should be more grateful, etc. That's how it starts. But by the time you get to the middle, you're no longer questioning whether something is off and whether you need to be more grateful. You're just trying to figure out the solution, which, again, is where Alex is at from my perspective, or what it feels like he's at. Versus someone who is more at the end of the wrestling, which or a more crisis stage. Like, sometimes I have clients who they hate their business, they hate their life, right? And it's like, oh, that person is not at the beginning, they're not at the end, or they're not in the middle. They are at a whole different stage of being dissatisfied, being discontent. Okay. Um, I'm simplifying it down to someone who is simply out, or simply someone, let me say it differently. I'm simplifying it, right, down to someone who is simply wrestling with what's next, because when I initially watched the video, it did not seem that revelatory to me, right? Like I said, but lots of people were either A, deeply moved, right? They felt something resonated with them, or they had a lot of negative comments, right, about Alex and his, current situation. And those two responses made me sit with what I watched, right, to just kind of say, okay, well, why are people either deeply resonating with the video, right, or having a lot of negative comments about Alex, right? And there could be all kinds of reasons for that. Uh, but I think the thing that I would just say more than anything else is, one, I think it's revelatory for people because something about figuring out what's next or being in this balance of art versus science resonates, because most of us struggle with it. It's a normal thing, right? What was interesting is that Tony talked about him going through different seasons where he had a similar struggle, right? And despite him making that comment, I didn't see anybody, not to say that people didn't do it, but of all the comments and posts and whatnot that I read, I didn't see people demonizing Tony for the season that he had when he was wrestling, right? But despite that, I've seen a lot of comments where people were saying, oh, Tony took off Alex's mask, or things like how delighted people were to see Tony give him a life lesson on what's really important, or people being surprised at Alex's willingness to be, vulnerable and humble publicly, right? Um, Comments like, it's rare for Alex to be open and transparent. One of the ones that I really not loved, I was gonna say hypothetically. I'm air quoting it so you can't see it. But one of the comments that I read that I thought was so funny was, I always knew he was a sinking ship. And I was like, bruh, like what's happening right now? Uh, Lots of comments around just expecting the interview. Oh, then another comment that I read was around Alex expected an interview, but accidentally ran into the lesson of a lifetime. Right. And I say all of this to say that these comments really struck me. Um, because it appears as if people are not observing accurately. Number one, when Alex opened the video, the first thing he said was, I could go one or two ways with this interview. I could ask the questions that I know my audience wants to hear and, make this a lot more about content and whatnot. Or I could just ask the questions that I want to know. And he said, I'm choosing the latter. So to me, he knew what he was getting himself into. He was prepared for the tough. I mean, he knows who he's talking to. He's talking to Tony Robbins, the person who's going to say all the woo-woo stuff to you, right? So he knew what he was getting himself into. He intentionally did that. He said it out loud, and somehow, we missed it. Um, okay, so here's my second point. After thinking, oh, this is a person who is just wrestling with what is next, the second thing that I thought about was a lot of the comments that I read was around Alex basically not being able to feel, right? Like he's just such a workaholic, that, he has a hard time feeling. And I get it. I understand why people might say that. But what was interesting to me is that I believe that he expresses feelings in nearly every video that he does. Right. Again, I told you I watch a lot of Alex's content, and almost every single one, feelings all through it. Right. And he shows vulnerability in plenty of them. Like literally plenty of, not all of them, right? But again, depending on how much content you write of his, watch of his, maybe you see it, maybe you don't. But he shows up pretty similarly in almost every single video. Every once in a while, he gets extremely passionate, right? And then you really see emotion. But mostly, he shows up the same every single video. Um, which is kind of why people's words surprise me. And then I had to remember that people tend to think in absolutes, right? It's either black or white. It's either this or that, right? So, of course, if you had to choose between seeing him as a very logical, willful, hardworking person versus more of a creative or warm or, right, fuzzy kind of course, you're going to choose logic and strong and disciplined because that is his predominant way of showing up. But I just want to be clear that just because his predominant way of showing up is one way does not mean he does not feel. Like it to think in black and white terms, in all or none kind of terms, is a trauma response, right? Like what we want to be able to do is realize how much there is gray. I wish there wasn't gray. I wish it was just black and white all the time. But unfortunately, that is not the reality in which we live in, right? So I never thought that Alex had a problem feeling, right? I do think that he has a problem allowing the right feelings. And I use the word problem loosely, right? Because humans are constantly trying to label things, right? Mostly because we love certainty, and labels make us feel certain, even though they do not guarantee certainty in any kind of way, but it definitely makes us feel like certain. Definitely makes us feel more certain, right? But I just want to reinforce that it's a natural part of being human, which is why I see this less of a problem, right? I see this less as some kind of monumental uh or life. I mean, I think the interview could be life altering because you're sitting with one of the greats, right? I think Alex sitting with Tony could be a life-altering moment, but for reasons different than what I think some people are perceiving, right? So that's my kind of my second overall point here, is that just because someone does not feel the way that you feel, and not meaning we agree, but I mean like actually experiences feelings the way that you feel, or does not express feelings the way that other people express feelings. Uh, Even in his own words, where he talked about having a problem with apathy, right? I actually think that he's naming it incorrectly, right? But like, again, even if we just took his words at face value, apathy does not mean no emotion, right? Like, anyway, I could go on about that, but that's kind of the second thing that I took from um the video, is how much people feel like he doesn't show any emotion because he is on the science of achievement side of things, right? He is about achieving and getting things done, and most people who are on the achievement side tend to be less feeling oriented. So it's not that it's crazy for people to think that. I just think that it is inaccurate, is what I would say. Normal does not mean healthy. Okay, so here's my other point. I think I want to just point out the fact that Alex isn't doing something he hates. Right? He's not miserable. I think that, and again, he's the only one that could accurately say whether he's miserable or not. This is just my personal take, okay? But a lot of the commentary that I hear or that I read around the video was how he's clearly miserable, and how, a lot of his childhood relationship with his dad, really screwed him up. And it's like, I'm not sure you're listening, right? Like, is there trauma in there? Sure. We all have trauma. There's not a person on this planet that has not experienced traumas. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Um, but one of the things that he said in the video was, I work a lot, and finding enjoyment outside of work is my problem, right? He talked a little bit about the reason why he does this is not because he's driven, right? But he just doesn't know what else to do, right? And I just want to be clear that not knowing what else to do does not mean I'm miserable. I'm unsatisfied, I'm unfulfilled, but neither one of those equal miserable, right? And I just want to point that out, because I think, again, it's one of those all or none kind of absolute thinking. Um, and I think what we're witnessing is, especially in Tony's response to him saying that, is that there is a difference between, uh, obviously, this is like duh, LaChelle, but probably the best way I can explain this is that Tony is an impact first kind of person, and Alex is not. And this is not to criminalize him. There are a lot of people on the planet that are not impact first, right? So this is not to say he should be impact first. I'm just pointing out the obvious, right? The way that the two people operate is very different, right? You can tell that one of Tony's core values is impact, right? And so he makes his decisions through that lens. What I'm curious about is what Alex's core values are. Some of them are a little more obvious, but if I had to prioritize them and say, well, what are his top three core values? Number one, I don't know. So let me just pause there, right? But they're clear. What is clear is that they're different than Tony's, which is why he's making different decisions and showing up in a different way, right? But I'm saying all of that to say that different doesn't have to be absolute. It doesn't have to be he's miserable, right? And I just would be careful with that. Um, I think the other thing that I would point out here is that what we're actually looking at is someone who is misaligned. And again, we all get misaligned, which is why, it is a very normal thing to get misaligned. One of the things that we do in our camp, and when I say camp, I mean in our programs, is that we have quarterly resets. We have quarterly either events, calls, whatever they end up being, where we're literally getting back in alignment, making sure we are aligned, seeing where we are unaligned every single quarter, because alignment is one of those things that you have to do ongoing. It is not a one and done. And most of the clients that I have that are wealthy, right, meaning they have built seven-figure businesses or above, they all hit this spot, right? Because once you have made a bunch of money, people tend to switch to impact, especially if they, number one, were always an impact person and just got lost in the business of it, right? Or maybe they weren't an impact person, but now they're becoming an impact person. It's very normal for people to be in the spot. All right. So that's I don't know what point I'm on, maybe the third point, right? Is to find this, to change our language around him being miserable or doing something that he hates, uh, to being able to say, oh, this is called misalignment. And alignment is our first, I think this is probably the best way that I could say it, is that your first responsibility is to act in accordance to your values, right? Which I don't doubt that Alex is probably doing, right? But then the part that we sometimes miss or we don't understand is that once you've learned to act in accordance to your values, you then have to learn to act in accordance with your vision. Those are not the same. A lot of times we are acting in alignment with our values more than we're acting in alignment with our vision. But the two are going to create some conflict many times, for which that's a whole conversation within itself, right? But I want you to hear that if you are someone who is struggling with your own fulfillment or your own achievement, are you acting in alignment with your vision or are you acting in alignment with your values? And a better way to say that is, to what degree are you acting in alignment with your visions and or your values? Okay. Let me tell you the one place where I disagree with um something that Tony said, or maybe multiple things that he said, but they're all under this one context. Okay. I talked a little bit about this on social and also with a couple of people via DM, because I had several people. I made a comment on a couple of different people's um posts, because again I saw so many posts about Tony. Some of them, most of them, I just did not comment. I ignored, but there were a few that I actually commented on, and as a result, I had several people DM me, for different things. Some of it was just appreciating the comments. Some of it was about services. Some of this is about their own challenges, etc. And so one of the things that we talked about, and I also wrote a little bit about it on social, is I'm going to try to do the short version of this. For those of you specifically who are struggling with the balance, how do I balance achievement with fulfillment? Here's something that I really want you to kind of consider, that I saw as I was watching this dialogue between the two people. Okay. And this again is where I disagree with Tony. Basically, in the interview, Tony is offering his suggestions and walking Alex through, kind of a discovery path of how to lean into the art of fulfillment and less leaning on the science of achievement, right? And that concept makes perfect sense. I think the way that Tony, talks about the two concepts, achievement and fulfillment, is great. The problem that I saw, which is often something that I see in the online space, the online coaching space, is he was only giving him a very narrow definition. And, in some ways, it felt like the wrong definition of the concept he was trying to help Alex through, right? So he was trying to get him to understand more about fulfillment and less about achievement, right? Alex has already killed achievement. He does not need any help with that piece, right? But the challenge is when Tony was talking about the concept of fulfillment, he was talking about it primarily through the lens of contribution and impact, right? Most of his conversation was about this one piece. But the thing is that the art of fulfillment is not about contribution. The art of fulfillment is about meaning, right? And meaning is not synonymous with contribution, right? It can be. You can absolutely, your definition of meaning or how you find meaning can absolutely be through contribution, but it could absolutely not. It does not have to be so impact driven. Okay. And if we're not careful, or if we confuse these two things, we end up going down a path of contribution and not meaning, because we're using the words simultaneously, which is great for the world, right? Like if Alex decides to go off and do some kind of amazing contribution, fantastic. It would be great for whoever he's helping, but it wouldn't solve his current dilemma. He would then move from being in the middle of wrestling to now being even in a worse place of wrestling. And to be clear, as I stated at the beginning of this, I'm an impact person, right? That's why I became a therapist. That's why most of the clients I work with are also impact driven. So I hope that Alex's expression of fulfillment and meaning is impact, but also simultaneously, who cares what I want for Alex? Like, that feels very irrelevant. What matters is, what does Alex want for himself? Right? That's it. And so his whole, this idea that Tony was leading him down, helping 100,000 men have $100,000 in the bank is a fantastic goal, if in fact that is where Alex finds meaning. Right? And to be clear, coaching someone on demand is challenging for most people, right? I don't doubt that if Tony had been prepared for the specific conversation or the specific questions, if he knew which direction this was going to go, um, he could have given a more full answer rather than focusing so heavily on contribution as the only way, or the primary way for Alex to be fulfilled. Right? I don't doubt that, this is not a critique of his coaching or his coaching ability or his coaching skill. This is just him having a conversation in the heat of the moment. Right? And the truth is, I only point this out because I'm specifically talking to the people who are wrestling with their own fulfillment, their own science, they're trying to balance the two within themselves. Right? And if that is you, it becomes even more important that you do not confuse meaning with contribution. Right? Because if you do, right, you end up someplace that you don't want to be. Right? I do not want you to be harmed by a narrow definition. That's my point. And when we as coaches give half answers or communicate without context, we potentially harm people, right? They go off and they spend years, like time they can't get back. They spend money, countless hours, they spend energy, right? Only to end up someplace that they never wanted to be. That is one of the biggest critiques that I have about the online space, is what I have termed coach hurt, which is similar to like church hurt in the Black community. It's not intentional, right? But it is 100% preventable, right? These are the things that cause people to lose themselves and also cause them to lose their resources, right? Their time, their money, their energy, etc. So that's just I don't know, again, what topic I'm on point before. Here's the other thing that I would say that I kind of feel is important to say about this entire scenario. I don't think that we realize what it costs to win. Right. And you get to define win, whatever your goals are, right? Replace that with win, right? Whether you're trying to build $1 million business or a multi-million-dollar business, whether you are trying to, I don't know, take care of your family and make sure that they, are well taken care of after you're gone, whether it doesn't matter, like whatever it is that you're going for, I don't think we realize what it costs to win. We are all aware that it costs to win, right? We feel that every day as entrepreneurs. We feel that every day as leaders going after whatever goals and, impact that we're pushing for. But it's not that it costs to win, but what it costs to win, right? In order to win, i.e., be successful, meaning whatever it is that you want, right? I don't necessarily mean wealth, although if that's what you want, then replace it, right? The thing is that when you have a 6 or 7 figure business, that's not what I'm talking about, right? Because the truth is, while that is a big feat, right? It is a big feat. A lot of people never get to 6 and 7 figures. When you look at stats in the entrepreneur space, a lot of people never get there. So it's not to say that it's not a big win. But what I am saying is that the bigger the thing that you're going after, the more successful you're trying to be, right? A lot of my clients are trying to change the world in some way, shape, or fashion. So let's use that as an example, right? They're trying to change an entire system or, uproot some, systemic problem or something like that. When you have a bigger goal, I don't think people realize what it costs to win, right? Like, the bigger the thing you're going after, the more detachment is required, right? When you're trying to build a 6-figure business, you could keep a lot of things and still hit 6 figures. You can keep a fair amount of things and hit 7 figures. But when you are going after something much bigger than yourself, it requires a level of detachment, right? I want you to think about not rich, but wealthy, right? So when I think about wealthy, you don't have want for things, right? You can employ people, right? Pick your own definition of wealthy. That's what matters. And whatever definition that is, it requires that you detach from your emotions. Like, to hear me clearly, I'm not saying that you should not feel. Like, no, you 100% should feel, because if you don't, that will get stuck in your body and it will create other problems. So I'm not suggesting that you don't feel. What I am suggesting is that your feelings are not what's leading you, right? It's like the way we talk about this is that the goal here is to be 100% committed and 100% detached. Because when you are attached, that is when you begin to invite suffering, when you're attached to things, right? And so the truth is, there should be very few things that we're attached to. Because attachment is about what you make that thing mean about who you are. Does that make sense? Okay. So when I say what you make that thing mean about who you are, let's use being a business owner as an example, since most people here will be able to relate to that. You need to be able to detach from business owner as a title to who you are, the same way that you would need to detach from whatever title you had if you had a job. Doesn't mean that you don't do your work. Doesn't mean that you don't like what you do. Again, the goal is 100% committed and 100% detached. And now you're thinking, LaChelle, how the hell do you do that? Yeah, that's the work. That is the thing that is not easy to do, but that is what you're witnessing, at least the positive side, when you think about the science of achievement and the things that Alex has been able to accomplish. One of the more recent being his $100,000 launch in a weekend, maybe even a day. Well, that's an amazing feat that 99.9% of the population will never do. And that level of success, even half of that success, 1/4 of that success, requires that you learn how to detach, my friend. It's not optional, it is required. So, yes, is Alex's content, his message, his demeanor unbalanced from the perspective of hard work and heavily leaning towards achievement? Yes, 100%. right? I remember one time I was watching his video. This was a while ago. I don't know what the video was about, but God told me very clearly, you need to stop listening to him as it relates. Hear this, because this is not about all or none thinking, right? I still love it, Alex's content, but God was very clear to me, right? You are someone who is prone to overworking. You are someone who has a proclivity for working hard. And if you are not careful, you will lean into this hard work thing that he has, and it will get on you. So you need to be very mindful of this part of the message. And I was like, duly noted, right? It doesn't mean I can't take other things from him, marketing tips or sales tips or team tips or, whatever else. But I had to be very mindful that, oh, this part right here, that doesn't apply to you. Okay. What we call eat the meat, spit out the bones. So yes, it is very clear, right? A blind man could see that Alex leans a certain way, right? But here's the thing that I really want you to hear when I say I don't think you realize what it costs to win, is that luckily for you, like most of us aren't there yet. And when I say there, I mean this balance between the science of achievement and the art of fulfillment. Most of us are on the art of fulfillment side. Most of us have not mastered the science of achievement side. Like, that's what I want you to hear. Most people have a long way to go and have not even scratched the surface of their potential because they have not mastered the art or the science of achievement, right? So while Alex is heavy on the science of achievement, he is definitely leaning. It's like, the truth is, that's the part you need. Like, if we was just being honest, that is the part that applies to you most. So I would be careful with, like, oh, he's leaning so much in to fulfillment nowadays. Like, this whole thing is going to change him. And I knew, that I needed to do that too. And I've been sure. And it's like, be mindful of what applies to you and what does not, friend. Okay. Most people lean far more on the art of fulfillment side and are still unhappy, by the way, still unsatisfied, still not where they want to be, right? So it's like, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to be clear on, okay, well, which one of these is a bigger issue based on my goals and based on where I'm at? I want to ask you, does that make sense again? But you can't answer me. Okay. Okay. So here's the piece that I want to address that I kind of saw as a thread that kept coming up in posts and comments. And then let's talk about you, because that's the meat. That's the stuff we really want to talk to. And this is a podcast that's much longer than my normal podcast. So thank you for your patience. Okay. Usually I'm not going 82 minutes with podcasts. So one of the trends that I saw a lot in people's comments, posts, etc., was about trauma. Okay. It was basically talking about them seeing deep trauma with Alex and his father, right? That he is some version of still being a little boy. That basically, I'm summarizing, basically feeling like he'll receive what he never got as a child, right? If he goes on to accomplish big things. Like, there was all this commentary around him being traumatized in some way, shape, or fashion. And that is how he ultimately got to this place. Okay. And this place meaning wrestling with what is next. And I thought that was just such an interesting perspective as someone who works with people with trauma. That is not what I would have said. I can understand why people would make that assumption. But again, I think that we as a culture love to label things because it just, our brains work with putting things in boxes. That's why we put ourselves in boxes. We put people in boxes. We put things in boxes. But it often is not quite as black and white as we would like it to be. Right? Like, the first thing that I thought about was when Tony was sharing the times that he has been in a similar spot, meaning wrestling with what's next, trying to figure out if there's more to life than this, uh, it wasn't trauma for him. Why would it need to be trauma for Alex? Right? Uh, the fact that Alex has openly talked about his relationship with his dad multiple times in multiple videos, which speaks to his vulnerability and his feelings to some degree, because he does express feelings as he tells those stories. Um, just because someone told that story 3 years ago does not mean, and more than 3 years ago at this point, um, like, I just would be careful with seeing everything through that lens, because it doesn't feel, just because you're evolving doesn't mean that that thing is still affecting you in the same way, right? Because here's the truth. You should also have things in your life that once served you that don't now, right? So the fact that he used to say fuck happiness and now he may or may not take that with him into the next season, does that have to be trauma? Or could he just be evolving? Could he just be saying, oh, this mindset that I once served, that I once had, does not serve me? And by the way, a big part of that mindset didn't have anything to do with his dad. Some of it did, right? Like, when you listen to his story, he talks about his relationship, but a lot of it has to do with what he just did not like in the self-help world. The books that he was reading and the things that he was consuming was not helping him. It had more to do with that than it had to do with his relationship to his father. And so I just would be careful with, labeling people in that way, including yourself, right? Like, I think that when people are extreme like him, the Elon Musks of the world, the Alex Hormozis, put him in the same category, don't put him in the same category. But people who are extreme, the Steve Jobs, all of that, they tend to be more criticized because they are different, right? But I would be careful with criminalizing someone or criticizing someone because you disagree with them, or because you disagree with their lifestyle, or, any version of that. Right. And I say all that to say that just because someone is apathetic, someone who is detached, does not mean they're automatically traumatized. Could they be? Sure. That could be. But it does not mean it's automatically. And I think that a lot of people were kind of jumping to an automatic thing. Um, there are things that Alex has very deep emotions around. He loves his work. He loves his wife. Does he need to have 18 things that he is deeply emotional about? I don't think so. I think we should be less attached to things, not more, right? So anyway, I could go on a whole long tangent just around trauma. Uh, but the only part that I really wanted to pull back is that I would be careful with pathologizing yourself, and be careful with pathologizing other people. And pathologizing is just a word that we use that is basically clinical in nature for in the therapy world, which is basically giving a clinical diagnosis to a normal human behavior, right? Like, the more we know, the more we label things that are 100% normal with some kind of diagnosis, the more that normal behavior starts to, uh, again, be criticized, criminalized, seen as negative. It's like, well, do we need to see it as negative, or can we just see it as normal? Right? Like, I actually don't think that he is in some kind of extreme trauma state. Has he experienced trauma? Sure. Right? Is his relationship with his father still affecting him? Sure. Right? But so is your relationship with your parents. So is the relationship with your siblings and your teacher. And again, criminalizing things that are 100% normal or criticizing is a slippery slope. Okay? So here's the other thing that I saw that I just wanted to address as we transition and we start talking about how you can find balance between uh, the art of fulfillment and the science of achievement. In our camp, we just call it balancing your ambition with your capacity. Okay? We talk about that a lot. So I'm going to give you some suggestions. So if you are someone who is feeling a lot of tension, right, with your business or with your work, right? A lot of entrepreneurs constantly feel behind. They constantly feel like they have a lot going on, right? They just feel like they're kind of go, 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 right? If you happen to be in that spot, which is making, you know, causing you to question your own, what we would call is your relationship to work, but it's essentially causing you to question this whole science of achievement, then this section right here is going to be for you. Because what I want to do is talk you through some suggestions, okay, on how you can find your own balance. Whether you are mostly on the fulfillment side and you need to be more on the achievement side, or whether you're more on the achievement side and you need to be on the fulfillment side. Okay. The first thing I would say is that when you start talking about the science of achievement, what you're talking about is something external, right? You're talking about what you do. When you're talking about the art of fulfillment, you're talking about something internal, right? If achievement is what you do, fulfillment is why you choose to do that thing, right? And the problem that most people have, particularly entrepreneurs, because they get so much of their worth from their business, is that most people don't separate those two things. They don't separate them and the business. They don't separate what they do from who they are. And when you don't do that, you will Lord have mercy, I'm stumbling over my words. You will inevitably end up in this place of wrestling, because what you're trying to do is use one to solve the other, right? You're trying to, like when you're in achievement, you're achieving to feel fulfilled. And when you're all trying to feel more fulfilled, you avoid discipline of achievement, right? It's like this vicious cycle, right? Because we have not learned to separate the two. The business has needs and you have needs. You have to learn to give yourself what you need, and you have to learn to give the business what it needs. Oftentimes, that is our problem, is that we are not separating the two, right? We have this 4 quadrants. If you could see it, maybe I'll do it when I do it on YouTube, but we basically have these 4 quadrants where it's like some people are high achievement and low fulfillment. Some people are high fulfillment and low achievement, low achievement and low fulfillment, and then high achievement and high fulfillment. I know you probably like, girl, I can't see that graphic. Okay. But just imagine that there was a box, right? And you could either be at the top in achievement or at the low end of achievement. Same thing with fulfillment. You could either have high achievement or low achievement, which means there are basically 4 places that you could be, right? And when you are in the place of Alex, which we would count him as high achieving and low fulfillment, right? You win the game, but you lose yourself. We call those unfulfilled hustlers in our camp. Okay. The other side of this is that when you are high fulfillment but low achievement, right? You tend to be broke and a little bit happier. Not a lot, because a lot of broke people are not happy, right? But you're basically on the other side. Okay? You're more fulfilled, but you have less options to be able to help yourself and other people. Okay? I think the other thing that I want us to be clear on as we start talking about finding this balance is that part of the reason why people get stuck between these 4 quadrants, right, rather than being on the what we call the healthy high achiever side, right? So here's an example of what healthy high achievement can look like, where someone has both high ambition, right? They're the top 1%, but they're also not unfulfilled and miserable. Okay. So I do a lot of reading. I read a lot of stories about celebrities, about brands, about social movements, about psychologists, all kinds of things. One of them is around people who have had a lot of success, either in their career, right? So maybe they're a musician, an athlete, whatever, or brands who have built something successful. Okay. So one of the people that I studied was Kobe Bryant. And in his, I don't know if I would call it a memoir, but one of the books that I read about him, there was a lot of conversation around his schedule. And, if you know anything about Kobe Bryant, you don't have to know much to know that he was pretty obsessed, right, with basketball, right? He was very competitive. He always wanted to win. So he would be much more on the science of achievement side by other people's standards. Okay. But one of the things that I love about him is that, yes, he worked out more than the average person. He went harder than the average person. An example of that is he got up before everybody in his household. Don't quote me on the time because I might mess that up. The book was a long time ago, but 4 or 5 in the morning to go work out for 2 hours, right? And then he would come home, have breakfast with his family. Okay. Sometimes takes his, daughters to school. Then after breakfast, he would go back and work out for another hour or two. Okay. Typically multiple hours. Okay. Then again, come home, have dinner with the family. And then after dinner, after everyone is in bed, guess what? He goes and works out again. So he has gotten 3 workouts in one day, and most of those are multiple hour workouts, which means he is working harder than the average NBA player. He is working harder than the average person at their craft, right? So we could count him as a Alex Hormozi, if we will, right? There are lots of stories about uh him being invited to family vacations with other players, or after, invited to hang out after a game, he always declined. Right. So again, he could very well be put in that same category. But the beauty of it is that he also made plenty of time for the things that mattered most to him. Right. Remember, fulfillment is about meaning. Right. And so a big thing that was important to him was his wife and kids. And so while he could have just worked out all day or worked out multiple times and did not consider his household schedule, he figured out how to put both in. That's what balance looks like, right? Balance is not about equal time or equal energy. It's about priority in your decision making. Okay. So here are a couple of tips for those of you who are trying to find this balance within yourself. Number one of the first things that we teach in our public figure, not the first thing that we teach, but one of the first things is you have to learn to design from the inside out. Essentially, what we talk about here is you need to be internally led and not externally driven, right? Most people are externally driven, not internally led, right? Because internally led requires that you be clear about who you are and what you want, and not in a surface way, right? In a very nuanced way, right? Surface level is like if someone asks you to describe yourself. Oh, I'm this, I have these kind of values. Like most of us could do that with no issue, right? But the next level is being able to describe yourself with a great deal of nuance, right? So let's just use coaching as an example, because many of you that will be listening are coaches, right? So, the surface level understanding and the surface level clarity is like, oh, I like to coach, right? So I want to spend my time coaching. I want to, that's where my fulfillment comes from. Okay. Right. But again, in order to be internally led, you would have to know who you are and know what you want in detail, not in a yes or no binary kind of way, but to what degree, what level of clarity do you have? So that would look like, oh, I like to coach these kind of people on these kinds of topics at this time of day under these circumstances. And I don't like to coach these kind of people at this time of day on these kind of subjects, on these, in these kinds of scenarios. Most of us don't have that level of nuance. Sometimes we don't have the awareness, and sometimes we have the awareness, but we don't have the acceptance, right? To be internally led and not externally driven requires that you be courageous. It requires that you give yourself permission to go after what it is that you want, right? And to struggle through the feelings of it being big and scary or it feeling selfish. Like we have all these things that stop us, but that is the first thing I want you to think about. How can you become internally led and not externally driven and begin to design the life and business that you want from the inside out? The second thing that's going to help you as you find your balance is to learn to measure what matters, right? Like I could spend a whole 82 minutes just talking about this, but another way to say the same thing that people will probably be more familiar with in the online space is first principles thinking, right? It's like a lot of times we're doing all of these things that are not required. They're not necessary for us to reach our goals. But because we don't have the goals, we're not clear on the goals, we're not clear on what we want, everything becomes urgent. Everything becomes necessary, right? rather than saying this is the thing that is most important in order for me to get to my destination, right? This is how a lot of people begin to struggle with the balance of making a difference and making a dollar, right? A lot of people get lost. A lot of times so I'm thinking of a client right now. He runs a nonprofit, has run a nonprofit for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, has multiple seven-figure, organization. And what I find is that the longer and more successful you are, you end up in a very similar spot to Alex, where it's like now we need to move. How would I explain this? Essentially people get lost in the day to day, right? They get lost in the minutia, right? But if you learn to measure what matters, right? When you know what your needs are, you know what the business's needs are. If you know that, then you can keep track of where you are in relation to those needs. Remember when I said that the people in my program, we do this quarterly, right? Because life is very busy. It is very full. So it is very easy to get out of alignment because of all the things that are being thrown at you, right? But if you learn to measure what matters, right? For us, we talk about a lot about capacity. Usually we're measuring things externally. We always hear KPIs about the business, right? What are your numbers in marketing? And what are your numbers in sales? And blah, 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 which is cool. We need those, right? But you also need to learn to measure what matters internally, right? For us, we call this energy matters more than effort, right? This is how you learn to prioritize what matters most. And you choose what's worth measuring without ego, without pride, without trauma. Okay. The third suggestion I'm going to offer you is to learn to balance your ambition with your capacity, right? Achievement sets the direction, fulfillment sets the pace, right? Achievement is when I'm trying to say this clearly. One of the problems that I see is that when we are really geared towards achievement, and I have a whole thing that we talk about with the addiction to achievement. But essentially, when you're in that place, you think fulfillment is the reward for all of your hard work. It's like, oh, I will feel fulfilled when really fulfillment is the requirement, right, for you to be in the work. That's the switch that we have to make, right? When you're on more of the fulfillment side, you think achievement, i.e. doing, can also lead to all these other things. Well, I probably would say that differently, right? One of the things that we talk a lot about in our camp, which I will not go into this because I've already been talking for 97 minutes, is that the goal is to be strategic and then add speed, right? A lot of times when you're on the achievement side, you're speeding, you're doing, you're executing, right? But you're actually not creating leverage. You're not actually gaining momentum in the way that you desire, right? Because we're speeding without strategy, right? And so strategy means, different things when it comes to business versus you, right? But the goal is for you to be strategic and then speed. Remember, achievement sets the direction, fulfillment sets the pace. Okay? All right, so the fourth thing I would say, we talked a little bit about this already. Alignment is ongoing, which means it requires, not optional, check-ins. Like you have to, right? Because your needs change, your wants change, right? Industries change, right? Alignment is not a one-time thing, it is ongoing. So you need to have a way that you get and stay in alignment if you are trying to balance the art of fulfillment and the science of achievement. Last thing that I will say here. The other thing that's going to help you as you figure out this balance is that you have to learn to evolve and not pivot, right? Pivoting is about doing the next thing, right? You're moving from one thing to another. And there are plenty of times where pivoting makes sense and pivoting is normal. Okay. But many times we pivot when we should be evolving. Evolving is not about doing the next thing. Evolving is about going to your next level, right? Many people pivot when they are unsatisfied, right? So when you're in this place, a similar place where Alex is, and you're trying to figure out what's next, and you're trying to figure out how to feel more fulfilled, I want to encourage you to evolve and not pivot, for it to be a step up, not a lateral move. Okay? Because that's what I often see, is that people pivot and they pivot and they pivot, and they're not actually getting closer to their destination. They're not actually getting closer to where they want to be. And it just becomes more of a, oh, I did all of this work to pivot, and I'm still on the same level as I was before, which means you're actually losing momentum every time you pivot, right? This is how people end up in the wilderness, right? We call it the wilderness when you are in transition for longer than what you want, right? Most people are in transition for years, right? For those of you who are religious, I reference this to the story of Moses and the Israelites, where they literally, right, were going to go on less than a 14-day journey. Like, it literally is supposed to take them less than 14 days, and then they ended up being there for 40 years. How does that happen? Right? I studied and studied and studied because I was like, why? Like, Lord, I do not want to be in this spot. And most of my clients are in transition, right? They're also in this place, right? At least in the beginning when they come to me, right? A lot of them are trying to find their footing. Okay. So I just want to encourage you, evolve, right? Elevate, go to your next level. Do not just keep pivoting, right? A lot of times people pivot because of trauma. I call it entrepreneur trauma, right? Which is essentially you having a negative experience. So say you had, you know, it doesn't even actually have to be negative, but most of the time it is. So we'll just use a negative experience. So you had a failed launch, or you fired a team member, or you owe more taxes than you thought, or, any other million things that could happen as business owners, right? And that thing changes you, right? And oftentimes the change is subtle. You don't always see it immediately. Sometimes you do, right? And then you look up 6 months later and you are way more indecisive than you've ever been. You've lost your confidence. You've lost self-trust, right? That's what happens when you pivot and pivot and pivot versus evolve. Okay. So I hope this was helpful to you. Again, this was a much longer episode than I normally do. If you have questions, feel free to DM me on Facebook. I do not mind, right? If you have topics that you would like for us to talk about, right, there's also a form in the show notes for you to pop that topic in as a suggestion. If you need support with anything that we talked about, you can also DM me on Facebook. Okay. I will see you in the next episode.